this food is near and dear to so many different cultures, that are not Mexico specifically, or not Central America, or not even North America. Like, it has become a part of like the global fabric of our food system now. So I think that to me was a perfect example of just like reminding us that we're all connected, we're all human, we're all eating, and we all have our ways of kind of approaching things from just different perspectives, and like to celebrate that versus, distance it or say that this is less authentic.
Hey folks, welcome to episode 6 of season 2 of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Jorge Gaviria of Masienda. If you aren't familiar with Masienda, the company works with smallholder subsistence farms in Mexico to bring flavor-forward heirloom corn and corn products to world-class restaurants and food fans everywhere. Jorge originally started by sourcing heirloom corn for top chefs like Enrique Olvera, but the company's breakthrough product has been Masa Harina, an instant version of masa, aka corn dough, that just needs water added, enabling at-home cooks to make fresh tortillas, gorditas, and tostadas whenever they want. Since starting Masienda, Jorge also wrote what many considered the definitive book on masa, fittingly called Masa, which landed on pretty much every list of the best food books and cookbooks for 2022. It is also fitting that this episode is the last in season 2, as it connects a lot of the themes we've been investigating. From indigenous foodways and regional cuisine to rediscovering proven farming practices that operate in alignment with nature rather than against it. So without further delay, here's the latest episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Jorge Gaviria, founder of Masienda. So today on the podcast, we have Jorge Gaviria, the founder of Masienda. Thanks for joining us today, Jorge.
Thanks so much, Rick. Pleasure to be here.
Can you start off by telling us a little bit about what Masienda is? What makes it interesting? What makes it a cool company?
So Masienda is the Masa brand, or at least we're trying to be. Masa is the kind of connective tissue you find across Latin America. It's the dough that's made from corn, specifically nixtamalized corn. It's like this very, very ancient technique that makes the corn incredibly nutritious, and it's ground into a dough. So we're basically we're a corn dough company, and I'm proud to say it.
Reading a little bit about your background, I know you spent some time at Blue Hill. Dan Barber is another person we're going to have on the podcast. Sort of introduction of his book is all about the process of going through and discovering wheat, which sounds a little bit like maybe what you went through with corn. What was sort of your inspiration, I guess, to create a corn dough company in Masienda?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Dan Barber. I mean, I was working at Blue Hill at Stone Barns at the time when I kind of came up with the idea for Masienda, and it was around the time actually he was starting to tease his book more and more. In fact, I think his book launched when I started my job there. So it was all sort of hands on deck, thinking and talking about the book. And I just thought that this connection to like this sort of farm to table connection, this sort of next step it took, it was so compelling. It made so much sense. I was like totally on fire thinking about it. But working in that restaurant, it was very much sort of like a lot of French techniques, sort of very much kind of like this idea of new American cuisine in a lot of ways. And I really thought like, man, I'd love to see the foods that I grew up eating represented in this way, in these sort of like thoughtfully sort of sourced and curated and prepared ways where there's that connection again to what makes it so special. And when I think about foods that, define kind of the Latin experience at large, like masa is just it's so ubiquitous. And I joke that we have like a corn dough company, but like, this is like a $44 billion category across the world, if you sort of make up all the flours that it, can kind of come from and whatnot. So it's huge. And I think like, to me, what more difficult, staple crop to start trying to like improve or connect with in a deeper way than one that we think is synonymous with Frankenfood, right? Corn. Think about corn, you don't get a lot of warm and fuzzies if you're thinking about the type of corn that is actually going into masa, especially. It's like largely seems inedible. It's really hard. I'm not talking about field corn or sweet corn. It's the hard field corn that basically going to crack your tooth open if you try to eat it, without cooking it. Intellectually, it was really stimulating to me, like, working with this incredibly ubiquitous crop that we have that has a really bad rap. how do you improve that wrap? How do you make it taste better? And turns out that there were people, and have been people, doing this in corn's birthplace for thousands of years, just doing that, like improving it year over year, really focusing on that crop from a flavor perspective, not even thinking about yield, not thinking about amount of plants per square foot. Like it was really about flavor. It kind of all just hit. Like the more research I did, the more of an opportunity I realized there was to create a supply chain where corn was invented, which is in Mexico, and connect that corn to the best quality masa we could possibly make.
And so you work with heirloom growers in Mexico directly, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So we work with a network of about 2,000 smallholder farmers. And what's interesting about corn is that it's not a cash crop, even though we obviously pay cash for the crop. It's really thought of as a subsistence crop in Mexico, which is kind of one of these reasons why it's culturally stood the test of time, as in these communities, is that it has like a sacrosanct status. And, it's such a huge part of the diet. There's just such a tradition that comes with this crop, and, the foods that are prepared from it, masa being the main food. There was sort of like a built-in check and balance for quality. These are folks who are eating hundreds of pounds of corn a year. It should taste pretty good, and it is no surprise that it was the best tasting corn, I'd ever tasted in my life.
How did you go about forming those relationships? I was just listening to your episode of Dave Arnold's podcast. I think you talked about, you thought you might chip your tooth when one of the farmers asked you to try a corn kernel, but then you found it tasted like butternut squash, and I can't remember the other ingredient, but you were kind of blown away. So how did you go about creating those relationships and actually working with these growers directly?
Yeah. So just as there were a lot of growers that had been doing this, in their families for generations, there were a lot of preservation interests, whether that's like cultural preservation or agricultural preservation. There were a lot of interests that had a kind of a motivation to preserve heirloom corn in Mexico, because it's just, again, like you talk about, it touches everything. It touches food sovereignty. It touches politics. It touches, international trade, NAFTA. Like there were just, a lot of people had a sort of a perspective on this crop in Mexico. And so I kind of connected with a lot of those people. And, some of them led me toward these sort of communities where there was a little bit more organization to start with, potentially, just a group of growers who were maybe going to a local market to sell, for example, or a group of growers who were working with seed banks to kind of land on the right varietals that they wanted to actually store in these seed banks, and kind of like memorialize the community's preference for what makes the perfect corn from this particular region. And so I kind of connected with those folks. And, once we established a kind of a beachhead, as it were, like within these communities, we started to pay the premiums year over year, come back year over year, that kind of word of mouth spread. And so like, it was just now neighboring regions. It wasn't just one region. And then, we kind of, once we settled on a bit of a model, and after like 3 or 4 years felt like we had a good thing going, we started to really kind of think about how do you apply that to other states that are totally different culturally. Mexico's 32 states. You've got quite a few indigenous populations, lots of different languages spoken. And so those cultural nuances are different across the board. And so like, it was sort of fun to just see like, what about this model works in other places, what doesn't? And you just start to learn, so much about a group of people by just kind of like how they approach the agriculture that underpins the most significant source of their caloric intake.
I think customers now are getting used to labels like organic and regenerative, but from what I understand about a lot of the corn that's grown in that region, they still adhere to a largely, I think it's pronounced milpa or a milpa system. Yeah. Which inherently sounds quite farming in alignment with nature without necessarily needing to assign these sort of new age terms to it. How has that been working with farmers that are working with sort of this ancient agricultural system?
I think it's very humbling. It's also somewhat maddening. I think I'm always reminded like of just the wisdom of tradition, like we don't really need to stray too far from what is like the right thing to do and the right way to consume something. Like when you just sort of look at what propelled these civilizations forward in the first place, and it's like thousands of years of trial and error, and demonstrated success. And, Dan talked about that in his book. And I think I was just like, this was such a duh, this wasn't anything new and novel. And yet like, we're finding ways to kind of talk about it in quote unquote in sort of new and novel ways. And at the end of the day, this is just, it's been around, I think it's more regenerative than the kind of the jargon that we use to talk about it.
Is it accurate that one of your first customers was Enrique Olvera at Cosme, his restaurant in New York?
Yeah, I checked his coat at Blue Hill, and that's how I kind of reintroduced myself to him a few months later when I was starting Masienda.
That's a great story. And so I've seen interviews where he talks about the tortilla ladies being his heroes, and making a tortilla is almost poetic. So that's quite a high bar to meet at first in terms of entering the market with one of the best chefs in the world, producing some of those modern interpretations of what Mexican food is. How did you find that as the start? Like, how did he react to your product? What was he excited about? Did he give you specific feedback of what he was looking for, or how he was using the product?
So I wanted to start originally my like entry point into the conversation was going to be that I was going to start a tortilleria in New York. And that was, of course, going to be super easy, and like it was all easy. It was all super half baked. And I was doing this while still working full time at Blue Hill, and taking calls in the bathroom when I should have been like running to tables, with food, or just getting hands on food in the kitchen and bringing it out. But I reached out to him, telling him that I was planning on opening up this tortilleria, and do you want to buy any of my tortillas that don't exist yet? I'm using Mexican heirloom corn. It's going to be the first of its kind. And he actually took a while to respond. This was, I think, so I met him in September. In November, I reached out to him and I didn't hear anything. And I like reached out again, didn't hear anything. And so I finally just planned this like research trip that I was going to do in Mexico, where I finally was going to connect with some growers on the ground, see what we could do. And I arrived in Mexico in February. And the day I arrived in Mexico, he reached out to me. He said, "Hey, I'm in town before going to Germany for some event. Are you free to meet me at my restaurant at Pujol, and we can talk?" And I was like, oh my gosh, literally like an hour later, I was at the restaurant, was talking with him. He was a hero of mine at that moment, especially. And like, I was sort of awestruck, and he's like, "Look, I'm really interested in what you're doing. I don't actually want to buy your masa or your tortillas. I just want to buy the corn. We're going to be doing this process in-house." I said, "Oh man, that's amazing." So it forced me to just start becoming a supplier first as a way of building the business. And I thought that was actually, at the end of the day, consistent with kind of the approach I wanted to take in the first place, which is that, if you think about a lot of what was happening at that moment, when chefs especially, I think it's changed a little bit. It's become much more democratic in who can kind of influence culture. We have influencers now to thank for that. But, the idea is that I think at that moment, especially when cultural capital was so strong, you would see these ideas that they would introduce in kitchens, and like 5 to 7 years later, it would translate to a consumer packaged good of some kind, so like regenerative farming is something that's come up a lot. So a lot of that conversation was happening at Blue Hill, when I was there, and we didn't necessarily use that word for it, but it was all there, and it was all baked into it, like the idea of soil and soil health and flavor. And so I thought, man, if we play this right, and his restaurant is a success, the idea of masa, the education, the awareness, and certainly like the quality difference between what he's doing and maseca, which is like the complete opposite end of the spectrum, that will help move this sort of like market consciousness toward a place where we could actually have a pretty strong following for a product if we were to make it. And so that's kind of what happened. I mean, his restaurant went gangbusters. Cosme in New York City got a glowing review. The tortilla got like 2 or 3 paragraphs, from Pete Wells, just dedicated to like how beautiful the tortilla was. And no one had ever talked about a tortilla that way. And so like first, all chefs wanted to kind of jump on board and start copying what he was doing, because it just sounded really good. They didn't want to be left behind, where the kind of the zeitgeist was going in Mexican food. And then, eventually like home cooks started to reach out to us being like, "Hey, we kind of want to do this thing at home too. How do we do it? How do we buy it?" And so that conversation kind of just kept tumbling forward until we were able to finally start to launch, value-added products like Masa Harinas, which is really our flagship now. It's takes the work out of having to make, nixtamal from scratch, grind it, and we make it into a shelf-stable powder. So basically a 12 to 18-hour process. You can kind of just get the same experience within like a minute. Just add water to it and mix it.
I can attest it's a fantastic product. I was really excited to find a place that sells Mexican products that they import, and they have your Masienda, Masa Harina, just
Oh,
the white
awesome.
one right now here in London. And I was super excited to see that because the sort of consumer part of that, public facing part of that is relatively new, right? You've only been doing that for a couple of years.
Yeah, it was really the pandemic. I mean, we dipped our toe into retail with tortillas, but I think, and I still stand by that product. I think it's delicious. I love how we make it. It's, to me, I eat it every day. But I think that Masa Harinas is just kind of like, it met the moment of where we as consumers were, which was, I think the pandemic just kind of just, it was the silver lining from a consumer of food perspective, is that we became much more involved in the food that we eat. Sourdough, I did not. Did you do sourdough in 2020?
My wife did sourdough for a
Okay.
good few years, and she got quite good at it.
Yeah. Well, I was never, I've always been really intimidated by sourdough, and I did not. I was like maybe the one person who didn't do sourdough in 2020, but everybody else was doing it. And I think you realize just how amazing these foods that we take for granted are, really, if you connect with them on a more kind of intimate level. And masa is no exception. So I think people, as they've kind of wanted to understand their roots, that's something that's come up a lot, is that there are a lot of people who, like me, come from kind of like, you've got one toe in two different cultures, right? You're American, you are Latin, you're American, you're Mexican. There's sort of like this, you want to understand where you come from by way of food. And it's hard to do that sometimes when you're not actually like getting your fingers, in it. And it's different than going to a restaurant. So it's been really cool to see Masa Harina. It's certainly not what I would have expected. And I would have thought tortillas would be the thing that like people just want to make it easy. But Masa Harina has been, I mean, we sell tens of thousands of units of it now a month. And the pandemic, I think, is largely to thank for that kind of pivot and confidence boost that we needed to think of it as a hero product.
That's incredible. And it also a good kind of transition point into one of your more recent projects. So you actually wrote the book on masa.
Yeah.
What led to
A
that?
book.
Like, what was that process? I was just reading, like, it's on a million best cookbooks of 2022 list. I've heard, the history piece of it is also incredible. What led to the creation of that? Like, what was your inspiration?
The inspiration was I had always wanted to do it. I think as I was getting started myself in the masa business and kind of rabbit hole, I just realized like I didn't have much information to go off of. Dave Arnold had done the longest in-depth blog post on masa making. And, it was admittedly a culture he didn't feel like he identified with. And yet like he took this sort of deep scientific approach that he does. And it was awesome, but it was very limiting, because then I would talk to a grandmother, from Mexico, who had very different opinions. And like, that was all garbage, So I kind of, for myself, or she would say like, that's all garbage. Just, this is what you need to do. And it was much more sensual and like, tactile and not scientific at all. Which is not to say the food wasn't, but like the approaches were different, and they were going about it different ways. And so to me, I'd always been really curious about like what was common, what we were all saying different things, but the end goal was the same roughly. So I wanted to kind of connect those dots, and just needed like a sufficient amount of data points to do it. So finally, like a couple of years into Masienda, we did this small little booklet, it was like a Nixtamal book that was like 60 pages, self-published, and it sold thousands of copies. And we were like, this is nuts. We should do a feature-length book. Which, even with having a couple thousand copies sold of this little booklet, was a hard sell. I used to have a chip on my shoulder about it. Now I'm just like, I have to kind of embrace what it is, which is like, yeah, we're a masa flour, we're a masa corn dough business, right? Like, it's kind of funny saying it out loud, but like the truth is this is like anything but a niche market. It's humongous. It encompasses the entire world. We finally got the right agent and publisher to kind of like take a look at it. And it was right in 2019 when I was putting the proposal together. 2020 happened. I was like, we're going to go under. This is not going to work out. Masienda is going to die, because most of our customers were food service customers at that time. I should just give myself a project to like pass the time until we bury this thing. And like the deal came through, I think, March 2020. And I started basically writing all throughout 2020. And so it was like, in some ways, a bit of therapy. It was like a post-mortem is what I thought it was going to be. Like, if anything exists from Masienda, it's going to be this legacy of like the information that we've learned And then like, things turned a corner. Direct to consumer business took off. We started selling a lot more value added products. People were really enjoying this kind of product at home, and it took on a different tone. It was meant to be kind of the cornerstone educational piece for an audience to really take notice, and then, something we could build on. To me, I see it as like a foundational reference book, but like hopefully one of a few books that come up that we write, at least I write, that start to kind of tell this story in like fun and interesting ways beyond kind of the traditional applications that we know and love.
What were some things that you were either surprised by or found really interesting that maybe you weren't completely aware of when you went into writing or researching that book?
It was all really fun and surprising. I think there's so much information out there. There's so much like regional and cultural like posturing, and I think even within Mexico, some regions are like, oh, that's not how a huarache is really made, and like this is how it's really made. And it was really confusing at times. And I think to sort of zoom out, I kind of had an interesting perspective because I didn't grow up in Mexico. Spoiler alert, I grew up in Miami. I'm like come from a mixed family. My mom was born in Mexico, my dad was born in Cuba. Like I have an interesting kind of perspective to kind of like depersonalize some of this stuff, and report on it. But I think what was really amazing to me is just like, God, it's just it's impossible to fully document. There's impossible to be like a definitive book on anything because it's just constantly morphing. And I think the most shocking thing to me was just personally, I was really nervous about the project because of my cultural background and the reckoning that was happening in 2020 and continues to change the way we think and approach culture. And I was just nervous about why I had major imposter syndrome and like, why should I be writing this book? And I think it helped me understand my own identity and just like the identity of us as humans and food and, like all of this. Like it was just it was a humbling and I think like closure providing experience that I didn't expect. It was very cathartic.
I encourage everyone to check out the Masienda YouTube because there's amazing videos, many of which Jorge is in, little tutorials and explainers and all this other sort of stuff. But one that I happened upon a couple weeks ago, because we also had Chef Sean Sherman on the podcast. He did a wood ash nixtamalization video for Masienda. And I think it's really interesting, kind of the point you're talking about with this sort of identity and understanding just the expansive corn. Like I had never really thought about sort of indigenous North American cooking being associated with, corn and like masa harina or masa in the same way that I associated Mexican food growing up in Texas and California and having tacos. And it was really interesting to see sort of the cultural expanse, I think, of masa and corn and how it's been used really across the Americas and is now being recognized around the world. Is that something that you kind of just happened upon, or was there existing relationship with Sean, or how did that form?
Yeah, I mean, I think I reached out to Sean. I mean, I knew that there was an influence there, like the food way. That's what I think is so amazing to me, is that I felt really distanced culturally in some ways because it's all relative, right? Like I identify as Latino, and I can in some ways like identify culturally in a lot of different ways, but in a lot of different cultures, I should say. But I felt like I sort of alienated myself in some ways mentally, like psychologically. And what's so amazing to me is that this food is near and dear to so many different cultures, that are not Mexico specifically, or not Central America, or not even North America. Like it has become a part of like the global fabric of our food system now. So I think that to me was a perfect example of just like reminding us that we're all connected, we're all human, we're all eating, and we all have our ways of kind of approaching things from just different perspectives, and like to celebrate that versus, distance it or say that this is less authentic. And I think certainly the Native American story is an amazing one, in terms of how it continued to kind of build upon that food way and that food experience. And Sean always admired what he has done and how he's built it. And he actually bought a mill from us for Awamni. It kind of just was a perfect moment to just reach out and say, hey, this is something I've always wanted to do. It feels much more personal coming from you, given the fact that this is something you guys are using in the kitchen day to day. Would you want to approach it that way? And to me, I love celebrating what the community looks like, around this food, which is just like, it's diverse, it's unexpected. And to me, that was a really, really wonderful just collaboration that kind of brought that to life.
And it's really interesting hearing you talk about that because I read a lot of stories about corn and maize and how it's culturally viewed, especially in Mesoamerica. Corn needs human intervention to be edible and digestible and
Yeah.
vice versa. So it's really this intertwined relationship, which I don't know that you find in too many foodstuffs. And maybe that's why it's helped connect with so many different cultures.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a human food, it's like forget about the domesticated version of it. Like any version of it requires this human intervention. So to me, it's like a profoundly human experience to consume it and to interact with it and cook it. And yeah, it's also, I mean, yeah, depending on what perspective and historical account you're looking at, it's like, does it really run us or is it the other way around? I don't know. It's like a Michael Pollan-esque kind of question, but I do think that it's a mysterious crop that's worth getting to know a little bit better. We all eat it every day, so it's why not take that a little bit of extra time to get to know it.
What's the next step of Masienda? What does it look like? Are there new products? Are there new stories you want to tell? Like what are you thinking about doing next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty is that we finally have found the thing that sells itself, the thing that we've always kind of been building all along, and that's just masa, just a better quality masa product. And Masa Harinas is definitely the thing that is sort of the breakaway hit. And I think it's really fun to see a category that is, we're talking like putting on my retail hat, and what's interesting about it conceptually there, it's like it's a fun category that is kind of sleepy. Like people weren't really talking about it. Nobody really went to a Whole Foods to buy Masa Harina, you know what I mean? And I think intellectually, how do we sell and focus on a core group of products or product and just tell that story of how to use it and how to make it interesting to a wider and wider group of people who didn't necessarily grow up with this food.